Welcome to Conservation Fridays, where nature meets neighbor. I'm Jamie Lewis Hedges.
And I'm Rachel France. Today, I'm honored to welcome Matthew Bain, an aquatic specialist at the Grand Valley Metropolitan Council, GVMC, stationed in Grand Rapids, Michigan. With a deep-seated passion for aquatic ecosystems, Matthew has dedicated the past 4 years to studying and safeguarding the health of rivers and streams within the Lower Grand River. He holds a Master's of Science degree in biology with a specialization in aquatic ecology from Grand Valley State University, where his research focused on aquatic macroinvertebrate ecology and taxonomy. As an aquatic specialist, Matthew's primary role involves conducting macroinvertebrate sampling throughout the Lower Grand River watershed. This sampling is critical for monitoring water quality as different macroinvertebrate groups exhibit varying tolerances to pollution, providing valuable insights into the health of the river system. In addition to his fieldwork, Matthew is actively involved in education and community outreach efforts, collaborating on grant writing and sharing his expertise to raise awareness about the importance of preserving aquatic biodiversity. Matt, do you prefer Matthew or Matt?
Matt is usually what I go by.
Okay,
But I'm not averse to people saying Matthew, but typically everybody calls me Matt.
Great. That's kind of what I thought, but I wanted to make sure before I keep saying Matthew because it's a little harder to say. So Matt, how did you get interested or involved specifically in this line of work?
I would say all the way back to I went to Grand Rapids Community College for a couple of years, and I really went there for writing. I took all the writing courses I could. I would like to say in another life I was a writer. It seems like forever ago that I was doing poetry, nonfiction, creative nonfiction, fiction. And Dr. Matt Douglas, who works there, who is a butterfly specialist. He's also an entomologist. He's an amazing person. If you've never heard of him or met him, he's great. He really rekindled, I would say, a love of just biology in general, but insects especially. Insects, conservatively, 85% of all animals are insects. So by species and biomass is my understanding. So in his class, he really taught it at that level where a lot of classes you spend an equal portion on mammals, say, which doesn't necessarily make sense, to do it proportionally. So he really got me into that. And then when I transferred to Grand Valley once I got my associates at GRCC and focused on getting a bio degree, partly just I wanted to have something practical. Writing is always an important skill, but like Matt said, he said, well, I was already publishing some things here and there. He said, if you're already being published, having a degree is not going to really help. They're not going to look at that necessarily. So a degree in writing is more if you wanted to teach. And those jobs are really hard to get from what I understood. And I didn't know if I wanted to just be a teacher my whole life or so. I finished my undergrad there. I got to work with Dr. James Dunn, who's an entomologist, and he's taught all over the country. Just really passionate individual about biology, but insects especially. Terry Trier, too, is a great invertebrate biologist. A lot of fun. A lot of people remember him. He's retired now. And then I interned at WEMIAC, which is West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and I got to work with 4th through 6th grade. And I learned along with them about what a watershed is and some of those concepts and what non-point source pollutants are, because I didn't have an NRM background, a natural resource management background. So I actually learned a lot as I was teaching the kids about how all these things, we're saying it over and over, and just understanding what is actually impacting our watersheds. And I went back and I went to grad school at Grand Valley. Dr. Eric Snyder was my advisor. Again, if you don't know him, he's just really, really passionate individual, super positive. He's a lot different than me, where he's just eternal optimist sort of person. But that was helpful to me. I'm a little more I like to look at the worst case scenario and be prepared. And he's just like, no, nothing bad's going to ever happen sort of person. So just great balance there. And he helped me narrow my focus to aquatic insects, aquatic macroinvertebrates, and say, hey, what are you going to do with this material when you're done? Here's a practical application that's actually helpful, that you can monitor water quality, and you're still out there in the environment getting to work with, you know, the things that interest you. So it's all, I guess it's just all about trying, how do you turn it, you know, so if it was going to be writing, how do I make it practical where it is going to provide a paycheck, right? We all have to worry about that, keeping the lights on, so to speak. So how do you turn it into, take something and turn it into something practical? And I saw that easily with macroinvertebrates. A lot of the people that, many people that left GVSU with their grad degrees ended up working for our Department of Environmental Quality, otherwise known as Eagle. And so, yeah, I guess that's where I envisioned myself initially. We get to work with a lot of those folks. So
That's fascinating. I actually want to take a step back there. You've brought up about 6 things that I want to follow up on, but I think I think we can
sure.
double down on those later in the conversation. I wanted to go back to the writing. Tell me more about your love of writing, and like where did that germinate, and what is it about writing that interests you so much?
Boy, that's uh so for one thing, my mom was a librarian for a while. I grew up, so I should just quickly, I grew up in a small town up north. I've been here for about 25 years. I grew up on Lake Huron. My mom was she wasn't a teacher, but she worked at a library. So I always had access to just get whatever I wanted. I always had piles of books. And back then, even when computers became a big thing, we were in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't such a thing as Wi-Fi. You didn't even have any of those connections. So you actually read books a lot. I mean, I still try to, but we obviously have such access to so much digital information. So part of it might be a product of that, being in a small place and having access to all these, you know, books for free all the time.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, I guess I like stories. I like fiction. I love short stories. I felt like I was always just naturally coming up with stories. So writers like Ray Bradbury, especially, I'm forgetting some of the initial writers, but anybody that wrote really cool short stories, like scary stuff, or it could be
Mm.
supernatural, fantasy stuff sometimes. That was my first love. I
Mhm.
remember reading Jurassic Park before that was a movie. That book was actually published in 76, which is the year I was born, which is kind of crazy. But most people didn't figure out that that was a really interesting book until right before the movie came out, like myself. And um, yeah, so books like that, Interview with the Vampire was becoming a movie back then, so I made sure to read the book before the movie came out. Sorry about that. The lighting's in here. The lighting in our office is on this. Yeah, try not to move too much so it comes back on. But
No worries.
that's the first stirrings, I guess, of that. I love poetry. I took a lot of poetry workshops. I actually introduced a visiting poet at our downtown campus here.
Mm.
Uh, I took a 400 level poetry class, and the teacher thought I was, you know, good enough at that point and interested enough in poetry. And poetry allows you to express yourself in a way that I would say that we fundamentally lack in our common speech, because if you start to speak in that language, it just doesn't sound right, right? When you're having a conversation,
Mm.
you can speak poetically, but the way that poetry is written nowadays, like it's just another language. And if you started to just talk to someone like that, they're going to think something's wrong with this person. You know, so, and so it's this interesting language that's beautiful in a book, or if it's like, okay, I'm going to read poetry to you, then it's okay. But we can't even, it's just another way to cut right to I'd say like our emotional
Yeah.
circuitry. And it can touch people immediately in a way that science for all the data can't. It's kind of the same thing when you get someone out the first time they experience, you get them into a river and you show them something like, I don't know, something like a water scorpion,
Mhm.
or even like frogs, snakes, like with somebody that's never been exposed and that's in their hands all of a sudden. it's hard to put that into words. So it's similar. There's a similarity there, I guess.
There's a lot of great writers and great poets that really play in that space of what nature does for us, and the experiences of nature. One of my favorite books is called oh, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it's written by Linda Hogan, and explores a lot of different outdoor natural spaces. And I'm always fascinated by the way that people. There's another writer, a native writer, that says that words saved him, and that words are in themselves salvation. And I find that really interesting when we think about what we do in conservation work and in outdoor education, environmental education, um, how that we have to lean on that. We have to lean on the words and how we can use them, uh, in a way for our salvation. I'm wondering that if you think about that, or if you use those skills in any way from writing now when you do education with the public or public outreach.
I have only just so recently we had an event this week in town called River Rally, and uh, there are some individuals. One of the authors is David Warner's, who I believe pioneered Plaster Creek Stewards at Calvin, and his colleague is Gail, and I am blanking on her last name. I had never met her before, but they wrote a book called, I believe I just got a copy of it, but it was Reconciliation in a Michigan Watershed, I believe is the title, but it's all about just some of the degradation of, I guess, European settlement in some of these areas and what it might have looked like before, and just how we've decided to treat our waterways. And I think that really stirred something where I thought, wow, that just like that one little, so we went to they had one of their own little lectures on this mixed in with the others at River Rally. And that's just one that I chose to go to because I hadn't heard David Warner speak before, but you hear a lot about him from them. And it was amazing. And it touches you in another way, that some of this the data is not going to touch you. And so, yeah, it certainly got me thinking all of a sudden, like, hey, I used to do that kind of stuff. I mean, he's a professional writer, scientist, but I feel like we should bring that communication more. It's hard to find time, right? Because
Yeah.
we're busy. So it is definitely something that you do on your own time, but yeah, I need to find a space for that. I'm definitely thinking about it. I have like on our site sometimes so on the LGROW site there's a watershed news item, and I try to put a little bit of a slight spin, but there's not a lot of room there, and I don't want to I want to make sure it's something short enough where someone's actually going to read it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
try to put a little bit in there about some of the emotional investment,
Yeah.
but I could do a
Well,
better job for sure.
speaking of words, we want to spend some time on this conversation, learning from you on some of those words, like what is a watershed, and what are macroinvertebrates and how they fit into conservation and what's important. But before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit to folks about volunteering. If you're passionate about protecting the environment and making a positive impact in your community, you can volunteer with your local conservation district. For us this weekend, we have an event, Rachel, that's coming up, and we use volunteers at that event. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
We do. So we have this weekend is Berry County's Household Hazardous Waste Collection event where we collect scrap tires, unused and expired medications, household hazardous waste like motor oil, oil-based paints, household chemicals, pesticides, and also electronics. So we need a lot of bodies to help the folks of Berry County come through and help get rid of their stuff. including we've got volunteers from the sheriff's posse, volunteers from the district, the health department, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but we have a ton of volunteers, but we always need more.
So whether it's working at a recycling event, like we just described, or tree wrapping, habitat restoration, there are just countless ways that you can contribute to the preservation of our natural areas. By joining forces with your local conservation professionals, you'll support their efforts in natural resource management as well as safeguard your own community. And if you're excited about that, we encourage you to sign up with your local conservation district. To volunteer with Barry Conservation District, sign up at barrycd.org/give. Again, that's barrycd.org/GIVE.
So, Matt, back to watersheds. Like you were saying that you learned alongside these kids, and as you know, my first job out of college was at LGROW, or the Lower Grand River Organization of Watersheds, where I also learned what a watershed was, what non-point source pollution was. My degree is just in biology, but it was very focused on plants. And I'm sure they covered it, but can you tell us a little bit more about what a watershed is and why it's important to understand it?
Yeah, the way that I usually if I don't have any media up like I don't have now, if I'm just speaking with kids, I guess it could be any age group, right? I'll usually just make a bowl with my hands and say, just think of any watershed like a bowl, just that elevation of land where any precipitation that's hitting is going to drain. Imagine that I have, the center of my hands would be where a lake or a river or a stream would be. So all the area of land that drains to a central water body. And that usually takes, and then I usually go back and kind of bring that back up with them later. And also the idea that they're nested. So, for instance, like right now, our offices are in the direct drainage, but say you're in Plaster Creek. So Plaster Creek watershed, Plaster Creek drains into the Grand. So I'm in Plaster Creek, which is nested within the Grand, which is nested within Lake Michigan. And so I try to connect that all and say, well, this is why it matters what's going down our storm drain. Because a lot of people don't know. I don't know that I knew that beforehand. Everything that goes down the storm drain, I mean, there's catch basins, right, where some solids settle out, but typically anything that would be in solution going down the storm drain is going right into a river or stream here. I don't know if that's the same for the entire Lower Grand River watershed, but I know our area that it's separated. But Lansing, for instance, is not, is my understanding. They still have combined,
I
last I
did not
heard.
know that.
So,
Wow.
yeah,
I think it's a fascinating and important piece to really think about, because when you think about that bowl of your hand, I really like how you use that to explain what a watershed is. When you think about that and you talk to people about the importance of where their water is going, people think in smaller spaces. We think about the water that comes from our sprinkler into our yard, or when it's raining, the water that flows off into the street and it's going down the drain and out of sight, out of mind. And so for us here, we think about the Thornapple River, and, from our office, that's, almost a mile away. And we don't think about what happens here on our property affecting the Thornapple over there. But I think it's a really important concept to think about, and especially when we think about working together to protect our natural resources, in this case, water. We have to think larger, and think in a bigger way about that bowl. Does that sound right?
yes. And it is a bit overwhelming or for me, I think when just to switch my thoughts over to say, yeah, this is how we, loving those places that you go out into, creeks, rivers, streams, and the biology there, plants as well, that that this is how we treat these spaces, that at some point I didn't agree to it, but at some point that people thought, yeah, this is what we should do. We should drain our ag in just directly into this versus into retention ponds or a separate system. And our storm drain should go there. And yeah, it is a hurtful thing. Like when you think about, if you love those spaces, and obviously everybody, probably anybody listening to this, certainly on board, it is like, how do we get away from this? Can we get away from this? Is that even possible? Probably not. But yeah, it certainly makes you more mindful. It is almost overwhelming, the scope of sometimes the problem, right? Just the amount of stormwater, unfortunately. Like in Grand Rapids, it's a great city, but yeah, just like the amount of stormwater that we would deal with in a city like this off impervious surfaces alone. Even if we got, I think we do a great job of any kind of point source stuff and many of the non-points, but just stormwater and thermal pollution. It hits that impervious surface, it warms up and then warms up the river too.
Right. I know when I moved into my house, in Hastings here, it's a new build and all of the downspouts were connected to the storm system. So that was the first thing I did was disconnect every single one of those and I know it's a small impact, but it's just an example of all of the ways we are just inputting into those water systems every day, every minute of every day, sump pumps, everything.
I think it's important to find. I still have one rain gutter that is a problem where it is onto my driveway. Everything else is taken care of. We have natural growth. We do like a manual mower in the front yard. I don't mow anything in the back, and we have all kinds of cool plants. And we have like a little section where it drains. But I like you said, it's a negligible impact, but I think it is important to, and this is coming from the David Warner's talk, but and Ron Yob was also, and Gail was also present at that, so I don't want to undercut them. But just the idea of being complicit. So even if it's small, like you, Rachel, obviously have spearheaded this whole, the recycling program. It sounds like that you have there that and you're really passionate about that. And I mean, that's important that if we, each of us is at least trying to do the right thing too, and then kind of spread the word. I think that's really important. It's easy to like back off and say, well, it doesn't matter. Like with climate change, right? It doesn't matter if I burn a little less gas, but I think the complicity issue I think it is important. I think it's really important.
It's community thinking. I was just in Chicago yesterday, and we were at the Science and Technology Museum, and was reminded going through one of the exhibits there back during World War II, there was just a lot of communication about, watching what you do and say, because of the potential community fallout that could come from that. So there was like, the phrase loose lips sink ships, talking about being careful about what you say because you don't know who around you could be funneling that information to the enemy. But there was also a lot of conversation about, using less gas so that gas was reserved for use in warfare. There was, conversation about, what you can do for the war effort. And, after, getting done at work, it was going out to the community center to make bandages. So this expansion of it's not just, you as an individual, you are part of this national effort against tyranny and despotism abroad. And that reminds me of when we're talking about our yard is not this isolated half acre or quarter acre piece. This yard is part of a larger collective community. In this case, we're talking about the community of a watershed. And what happens here can go out and affect those things to the good or to the ill, which comes back to talking about, ecosystem health. We're talking about water quality, but water quality affects more than that, doesn't it?
Certainly, if it's going to come back to us sooner or later. LGROW's vision of connecting water with life, the way I think about that, or the way I just, if I'm giving a presentation thinking like right now our wastewater is just magically pumped away from us and we have clean water. It's just pumped right to us and we don't really think about it, including me. I don't always think about it. I do now, but in the past, I certainly didn't. But those systems can break down anytime. There's no promise. And just the idea that we're always going to have clean water. So even if I don't care about the biology, I don't have to worry about it. But obviously, we can easily overwhelm the system. Things can break down. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, now it's an emergency. Now I have to boil my water. Maybe even boiling won't help, right? With like harmful algae, you can't even boil the water. So, I mean, it does amaze me. It's like we always wait. This includes me in a lot of cases. So we just always wait until we're like right at the edge of the cliff and I've got 1 foot off and now we have to do something. So I think it's just important to say, can we not be on the edge with 1 foot off? Can we do before that happens? Because, with climate, with water, you have such a narrow window. With water, you have a really narrow window, right? If all of our water tomorrow is poison, or if we can't drink it,
Right.
I mean, it's scary. I don't know. It's like, and I mean, for me, I'm concerned about the biology. I love the organisms that we have, and even for their own sake, they don't have to exist for me or to feed me or anything else, but just their existence for their own sake is amazing to me. So I feel for those organisms, like being overwhelmed by what we do to the environment. But then there's a whole step back, even if you don't care about that. It's like all the cells of your body need water. And you're only going to have so long. It's going to be like a time bomb if you don't have it.
Yeah. So with these bugs, macroinvertebrates in water, and you spoke a little bit about how they're in, they indicate the health of the stream they're in. So can you give us some more information on that? And I'm thinking specifically from my time at LGROW with Plaster Creek and its history. And then I know you haven't had a ton of time to get into the Thornapple, but maybe there's another water body that that you know of that has excellent water quality. And maybe you can talk about just the different bugs and how they're showing us what the water quality is like, how they're painting that picture for us.
So my favorite spot that's, I would say, the closest best spot to here, there's a couple actually. One, there's a school group out today. They went out this morning. I had a number of other things where we couldn't commit, but we gave them materials. They're out at Seedman Park, and that's Honey Creek. And I am blanking at the moment. That might technically, it's got to be like on the edge of the Thornapple. It might be Bear Creek technically. The creek itself is called Honey Creek. It flows through Seedman Park, and it's just completely forested. It's beautiful. And when you go in there, and this would be for any water body, if you can pull out multiple families of stoneflies, that's already a great sign. I mean, that in and of itself, if I can go into a place, then there's places in the Rogue I can do this. If you can pull out 2 or 3 different families of stoneflies, that's fantastic. And then if you get some mayflies on top of that, some caddisflies that aren't net spinning, because the case building ones usually are more sensitive. Now, the common net spinning caddisfly that we're going to see in many spots is they sometimes prefer excess nutrients. So that's just why I want to put that quote when I say caddisflies are great. It's sometimes the net spinning ones can point to a problem, but in general, that's the trifecta of good water quality. If you go out and you find your couple stonefly families, a couple of maybe 4 or 5 mayfly families would not be uncommon in the Rogue for sure, or at Seedman, and then 3 or 4 caddisfly families on that. You could almost stop there. I mean, that right there is pretty much a sign of good water quality. All of those groups have really specific requirements. I would say starting with stoneflies, just their physiology, they need a lot of oxygen. So you've got to have good dissolved oxygen going in. And there's a lot of impacts to streams, that can pull oxygen out. but they have to, in general, have very, very clean water, high oxygenation, low temps, all things that make good trout streams too. So most people wouldn't care about that, but it would definitely make for good trout stream. Mayflies are really sensitive. Many of them have really soft gills. So there can't be a bunch of sediment in the stream because that's going to damage their gills. If you've got, say, like too much turbidity or too much just unnatural particles floating through there. Most of them are pretty sensitive, so they might either die off or just drift out of there. And caddisflies are somewhat similar. I would put them on the lower end. They seem to be able to deal with, a lot of times I will find some common families and even in like ag ditches. If nutrients are the only issue, sometimes they don't seem to have as big of a problem with that. And they're often, related to their shredding plants. So if you've got some nutrient issues, sometimes, that's the plants grow really well. So they're like, oh, okay, here's a lot of food for us. So if it's not overwhelming, like an overwhelming amount of nitrates or E. coli, they can at least deal with that. Stoneflies won't, for the most part. Most mayflies won't. You might find there's a couple smaller mayflies that don't seem to care, but most mayfly families not going to see them in that once you get that level of pollution.
We had a while back, we had a fish biologist on, I don't know if you know Addie Myers.
I saw that. I was going to listen to that one as well. I just saw that was that she had been on. I've never met her personally, but I had just sent her an email about a lamprey identification because somebody said I found a juvenile lamprey at Seedman, and I don't know, I haven't had time to study. We have some native lampreys, so it was injured, so I kept it, I preserved it. So I was reaching out to people to say, hey, how do I ID this? And she shared some material. But yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah.
But I've never met her in person.
She's great, and she did a good job on that episode talking about the the how the water space can be affected by temperature and how that temperature affects where the fish are, and she was using that as a good example. You're bringing up a couple of things that are standing out to me, like that oxygen and the right amount of oxygen is necessary for the aquatic organisms that live in the water. And other things like nutrients can play into that. There's a balance between too much and too little. Can you share a little bit more about that as it pertains to what an ecosystem is in the water for these aquatic organisms, and what are those variables and how they have to interact to really support health as opposed to getting out a threshold?
Yeah, if you get into a place where you could take a sample, and some of this is variable, without getting too far into the weeds on this. Some of this is going to be variable depending on what order of stream you have, because it is completely natural to start from headwaters and to sample all the way down, towards the mouth of a river, say. You are going to find different taxa. There's some that just are not going to be in in some of those places, right? Versus like a headwater, you're going to have more shredders. There's a full canopy, and you're getting a ton of leaves that are feeding that stream. So you've got a bunch of organisms that like to shred the leaves that are herbivores, I guess you'd say, or decomposers. And then as that canopy opens up and you don't have as much of that, and plus as the velocity picks up, that stuff is moving, you get different organisms that that reside in there, that perhaps like deeper water or sediment at the bottom of the stream, or they're predators that are off to the side. So there's some natural variation, but in general, a good headwater stream, you should have some stoneflies, a couple families. You should maybe have like 4 or 5 mayfly families. You should probably going to see like a handful of different caddisfly families. And then on top of that, you should have a pretty high diversity. You should have some fly larvae that are in there naturally. You should have some natural predators, like maybe a couple true bugs and beetles and dragonfly larvae that'll be under the banks. Usually scoop under the banks for that stuff. And if you've got some nice rocks in there, you'll have one of our common crayfish, the clear water crayfish. You'll have a bunch of those in there. Those are omnivores, so they can pop up in a lot of places if it's not too polluted. But ideally, you should be able to find most of those organisms as long as it's not like a tiny trickle. Like once that opens up to like a first order or second order through like a sixth order, you should be able to find all those. And it's going to be a little trickier as it widens, but.
And to like connect the plot here just real quick, if you don't, that tells you something about what's happening uphill in the watershed.
Yeah, so if you go into one of those headwaters, and maybe you already know there's a bunch of ag, and most places in Michigan that's going to be the case. There's going to be agriculture somewhere. Typically, what you might see is an overabundance of fly larvae because they can use the excess nutrients. So there's nothing wrong with the fly larvae, but you'll have a lot of black fly larvae. You'll have a lot of midge larvae. You'll have some other tolerant organisms like there's certain damselflies that don't seem to care, like just be pretty much anywhere, that are preying on those flies. You might have, scuds or like river shrimp. Some people will call them that. They just look like tiny little shrimp. Those are omnivores. They're not picky eaters. They can deal with like a certain amount of pollution. You'll have aquatic worms. But if that's all you find and you don't find any or very few, you probably won't find any stoneflies in a place like that. They just can't seem to deal with that pollution. And I think it probably has an effect maybe to, I don't know, maybe somehow warming up the stream. And you're probably not going to find many mayflies at all, maybe one type of caddis. So that typically would point to a nutrient problem. You might have like 50% might be fly larvae of your whole sample. Another 10% might be those hydrocycid, those net spinning caddis that I brought up before. They seem to do really well. They'll put up these little nets on rocks like fishing nets, and they'll just fish those nutrients out of the water and eat them. So as long as it's not an overwhelming amount of nutrients, they do okay. Like, so I'm in our office now, the Grand outside of here, it's a shallow reach. There's, probably a certain amount of nutrients in there that shouldn't be. But it's also getting a lot of sunlight because it's shallow. So you have a lot of plants. So there's a lot of fly larvae in there, and there's a lot of hydrocycid caddis flies. And in fact, if you walk down here, and the adults are all over the place. So if you don't like bugs and you're walking down there, you're not going to be happy because they just feed on a little nectar. They don't bother anybody, but they're like all over. They're coming out right now, and they're able to deal with that. I mean, there's just not really enough natural predators. There's a little too much algae in there, and that's probably, from whatever source, we're probably getting a bit too many, slight nutrient problem here. It would definitely point to a nutrient problem here from the samples that I've pulled, because it's like all flies, hydrocycids, and once in a while you do get some mayflies. Once in a while you get like a stray stonefly, but pretty much dominated by a handful of organisms that like nutrients, moderate nutrients.
Yeah. So as you know, we recently got a MICOR grant. So there's organizations like Eagle and the Michigan Clean Water Corps that fund macroinvertebrate surveys and things like that. So you and I are working together, LGROW and the Berry Conservation District and the Thornapple River Watershed Council. And we're going to be surveying some of these areas. And I'm really excited to go out and learn more with you, alongside you. I've done surveys in the past, and scuds and caddisflies are about, that's my limit. So I'm really excited to do the training and to learn more with you and get a better idea of how our water quality is in the Thornapple. And as you were talking about the headwaters, I was thinking about Mud Creek because it is a more agricultural sub-watershed of the Thornapple. So I'm really interested, and I know we haven't solidified our sites yet, but I'm really hopeful that we can get up in the headwaters there. And it would be interesting to me to see the difference between the headwaters and then where it drains into the Thornapple Lake, which is the river. But do you want to talk a little bit more about MyCore and just all of what that's going to encompass? Because you have a lot more experience with it than I do.
And and we will see, like, let's say everything was perfect from the headwaters down to the mouth, perfect river. There's something called river continuum theory, where they, have been able to track that even if everything is perfect, you will see a change in the community, but you would still, the reference conditions that we compare our data to with MyCore, or that the state compares their data to, so how we do that scoring system is still based on, what we would find. But yeah, then when we start putting in the non-point source pollutant problem, if it's a nutrient problem, you can start to track it, because you start to see groups. It's more about what's missing then, because you start to see, why isn't this here? This should be here, and you can usually tell that from that it's paired with a habitat assessment. So the bug assessment, for those that don't know, is, you do a habitat assessment as well, and that usually helps too. And having, like, both of you having that background, what you have more of an understanding of what's on the ground and where problem areas might be. So all of that will work together really well, I think, to help deduce problems. And we also have some Eagle folks that have a lot of knowledge that they can bring to the table too. I don't know if that answered your question. That's kind of a roundabout.
Yeah, maybe
way.
back up, and if somebody on the sidewalk with no background in this said, "Hey, I saw the headline that you got this MyCore grant. What is that?"
And I looked a little bit of this up last night, just so I had the official language of where this comes from, because I was always saying, and it was correct, but that funding comes from an executive order. And so the state has a certain amount of money because of an executive order, and Michigan State University, for whatever reason, helps to administer that money to organizations such as yours, such as ours, to assist the state in sampling water quality. Because they go out and they do what's called Procedure 51, which is just the advanced version. That's kind of like MyCore is just more of a watered down general version of Procedure 51 to sample a wadable stream. But just imagine how many rivers, creeks, streams that we have in Michigan. They can only hit they have like this 5-year rotation, I believe, for different basins. So Buck Creek, for instance, I think they're going to hit it this summer, but there was like a decade where they only have so many resources. So us going out and doing this, and other organizations across the state doing this, we're able to go and use that funding to fill those gaps. I mean, yes, it's volunteers doing it. It's not necessarily like, it might be led by a biologist, but it's not like professionals doing it. But at least we're able to gather that data and share it. And usually you can, any kind of severe problem, you're going to, once your boots are on the ground and people are out there, you can at least let them know, like, hey, this is, here's data, but then we found this is a severe problem. And I believe, so one of our Eagle friends, Dana Strauss, they had sampled a place in the Thornapple, and I am forgetting the name of the creek, but there was a definite pollutant issue, and I don't want to call it the organization just in case yet, but they were able to track that pollutant issue and actually get something fixed. Now, she obviously has a background and would know what to look for and who to reach out to, but all of us on the ground, if we find something that severe, we certainly can use this methodology and use this funding to, at the very least, bring that to light. So all the other stuff is fun, but yeah, then you can use it to say, like, this is a severe problem that we need to report to the state. And they might not have seen it because they only have so many people. They only have so much funding. They can only do so much. So we fill in that gap. Volunteers fill in that gap.
So, we're looking forward to having some great days. You said boots on the ground. In this case, it's waders on the ground, uh, with nets and fun things like that. It's a great opportunity for volunteers to get out and be a part of doing community science, community stewardship, which we're very excited to be a part of. Um, what for you, Matt? What's coming up next that you're really interested in?
Related to my core or just anything bio wise?
Anything bio-wise? What do you got going on?
There's a lot of muscle stuff coming up, and I love taxonomy. Uh, Mussels are tricky. I won't get into them necessarily, but yeah, when you're looking at like the juvenile forms to the fully adult large shells, but it's fun, right? Because they're a macroinvertebrate, but they're like this special category. Like we don't sample them the way that they're not included in my core. It's just if you see them, you mark them down. There's all kinds of permitting around mussels. So it's just an interesting area. Uh, we've been engaged in a sucker monitoring program. That's something I've just been on my own time, but a lot of like Joel Betts of Kent Conservation is doing that on his own as well. So many of us have been volunteering, partly because one of those fish is a state threatened fish, and a lot of people consider suckers trash fish, for instance. For instance, so yeah, I'm interested to do some more sucker ID. Some electrofishing would be great. That's another permitted thing, so I can't just run out and do it on my own necessarily without equipment permitting, but I would love to, hopefully be involved in some of that this summer. Yeah, those are the two big things. We have a bunch of other monitoring that we're going to be doing in a watershed here close to Grand Rapids called Mill Creek that
Mhm.
involves some lake monitoring.
Nice.
Working with the Parks Department and in Wyoming to put in some green stormwater infrastructure. So it's just a matter of finding funding for that. But just nice to have a lot of positive folks that all want to do similar things.
One last question. You had
Sure.
a fantastic mentor that saw your interest and gave you direction for someone who maybe listened to this or came out to one of the My Core events to do some work and was interested in macroinvertebrates, but doesn't even know what that is, or interested in water quality monitoring like this and doesn't have any background in it. Where would you send them for more information?
So they could reach out to us here at LGROW. My email is the best way to get a hold of me. And so I can provide that, or I don't know if it makes sense to speak it or if it's easier to just put it up
You
somewhere.
can, but how
But
about your website? Let's throw that up.
yeah, so LGROW, so LGROW.org. And you can reach out to us on that as well. Um,
And you're
assumably my
welcome to
email
share your email if you
provide.
want to.
Yeah, it's mine is just it's matt.bain, BAIN at GVMC.org. So it's LGROW is an environmental program within Grand Valley Metro Council. A little confusing. Most people just know LGROW, like from the environmental side, but we also have other departments here, transportation and a GIS department. So
And
yeah, myself, I'm trying to think who else. Uh, so what I would say is reach out to us and let's figure out what watershed you're in. And then once I know that, most of our subsheds, we work with a watershed group. Like I was out with the Rush Creek at a Rush Creek sub watershed meeting today. So if you were in Rush Creek, I would connect you immediately with them and also with myself. And then between the two of us, I'm sure we could find, some place to plug you in or get you the information you needed. If it was a thorn apple, I'd be sending them your way, or I'd say, hey, I'm involved in this, but they're there all the time. They've got the background. So let's talk to them and I'll, can help out as needed. That's usually the way that I would recommend it.
yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes LGROW such a valuable asset to have in West Michigan is you know, for us, we're very county centric, even though we occasionally do work in the entire watershed. We are mainly just in Berry County, but LGROW goes so much broader and has all the connections that, you know, that people might need. So I just really appreciate that about you. And Matt, thank you so much for all the talk today.
thank
Unfortunately,
you.
we are out of time. So next time we will be talking with Catherine Getty from Blue Zones about parks, trails, recreation, and food initiatives. So please join us right here, Friday, May 24th. And again, Matt, thanks for being part of Conservation Fridays, and to all of our listeners.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I appreciate the conversation, and yeah, I would just encourage everybody to reach out, find out what watershed you are in, reach out to us, reach out to the conservation district, and then try and get involved, try and do something that's close to your home first, and then reach out from there.
Definitely. And I'll drop that link in the description for the Find Your Watershed. That's one of my favorite
Oh,
tools.
yeah. Yep.
Have a good rest of your day, all.